So, friends, just a small note, we do have one concluding conversation about the earlier referenced shtisel segments that remain for us to discuss, and we'll schedule that in the not too distant future. We want to give people a chance to see the remaining parts of it. Um, and uh, I want to now shift to formally introducing my colleague of many years. Um, I have so many stories to tell you about Rabbi Gerry Goldstein, who has been one of the people that I would call an exemplar in my life. Uh, he was in many ways my Hillel rabbi, um, and he was he is and remains a friend of our family. He was the Misader Kiddushin, the rabbi for two of my children's weddings, and we have for many years we studied on Thursdays. I think for some 15 years. Um, in various places around the city of Los Angeles. And I don't think there's a family event or um, a book that each of us have read that we haven't had the opportunity to discuss. One of the things that I have always wanted to have is to ask Gerry to talk about his earlier career when he was first ordained, when he was a rabbi in Minneapolis. And he was involved early on with the issues of civil rights. In fact, civil rights, human rights have been one of the important themes of his rabbinate throughout the time I've known him, uh, whether it was death penalty work or civil rights. Um, Rabbi Gerry has always been on the front lines. And we have such a wonderful opportunity to learn from him. And I'm going to ask him to share with us his reflections, which we've entitled Reflections on a Rabbi That Began in Minneapolis, Thinking About Minneapolis in the Current Moment. And welcome to Beth Orr, and welcome to our congregation on Zoom.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, yes, I am an antique friend of Chaim Beliak. It was, but he misunderstands me. I wasn't in Minneapolis. I was in St. Paul. That's like saying
Right.
I was at the Mount Zion
Temple.
It's all right. I was the rabbi, an assistant rabbi, 27, 28 years old, just out of the Hebrew Union College, ordained as a rabbi in 63. And I went to Mount Zion Temple. That is the oldest synagogue in the old Northwest Territories. It's now a synagogue that it was founded back in the early 1800s, actually, when it was the frontier. It's now a stuffy, old Reform temple with antique legs. Very respectable place, right on Summit Avenue, center of St. Paul, Minnesota, down the street from the state capitol, on a street that's lined with grand churches of every denomination. On June 18th, in 1964, I was arrested, and the story was on the front page of the St. Paul and the Minneapolis newspapers and the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times and the Washington Post. I was arrested for trespassing. I was arrested for a malicious breach of the peace. And I was arrested for conspiracy. Now, if you think that goes over well in a nice old synagogue on a respectable street down the block from the state capitol, you're wrong. Actually, it may have been a high point in my relationship with the synagogue of which I was a rabbi. Here's the booking sheet, actually. You can't see it at that distance, but I have a picture of it. And there's a whole list of people that were arrested that day. And here's Gerald Goldstein from St. Paul, Minnesota. And it indicates the charges brought against me. And I went to jail. I was part of the largest mass arrest of rabbis in the history of the United States. That's some place to have, to be in the record books. The largest, there were 17 of us, Reform rabbis, all involved in these terrible acts which led to our arrest. And the question that Rabbi Chaim wants me to answer is, why did you go? Why did you want to be arrested? And I'll tell you the story because I've only told it about 100 times in my life. People are fascinated by a notion of a rabbi being treated like a common criminal. I had gone in just a couple of days before my arrest. I left St. Paul to go to the Central Conference of American Rabbis. That's the largest organization of rabbis probably in the world. All the Reform rabbis in the United States or elsewhere are members of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. Up to that point, I had never ever gone to the Central Conference of American Rabbis. I hadn't been a rabbi. But I went in 19, when was it? I'm losing my marbles here now. In 1964, okay, that's the anniversary. 1964, I'd gone off to Atlantic City for the convention. I just got there, and then that evening was the opening of the convention. And I was sort of awed to be in this audience of, 400 rabbis, all of them older than me, all of them gathered there, really notable rabbis who I had read about or heard at ordination or somewhere in my life. It was an awesome crowd to be part of, and I was the youngest. And right out of the box, right after the first greetings, Rabbi Cy Dresner was called upon, and he brought a message to us from Martin Luther King Jr. And it was inviting the Central Conference of American Rabbis to send a delegation to St. Augustine, Florida, to join with protest there against segregation. Now, I gotta tell you, I wasn't a civil rights advocate at that point. I hadn't really done anything out of the ordinary for a nice Jewish boy who grows up in Beverly Hills, California. I'd gone to Beverly High and I had been part of a project where a group of us guys during, I think it was my junior year, we did what nice middle class people can do. We went once a week after school from Beverly High. We had a carpool and we drove downtown to a settlement house in East LA, where boys and girls, mostly boys, from poor families, all of them of color, of course, came to play, to learn something about getting along with people. And so this was our nice training in patronizing the poor. We would go untrained 17, 16-year-olds, and we would spend the afternoon with these poor kids. That was generous. It's very nice. It was well intentioned. That's my background. I never took part in any protest. I never stood in any picket line, never that sort. But here I am in the Central Conference of American Rabbis Convention, 4 days of fine Jewish program ahead of me. And I listened to Rabbi Cy Dresner, read this note from Martin Luther King Jr. He wasn't yet St. Martin. He was not yet unnotable. I knew of him. I'd read some of the things that he had said or done, but I wasn't in the fan club. But I am a curious man. I like studying history, and it sounded like a moment to watch a moment of history unfold. I'd go down there with a group of rabbis, and we would help them in their protests somehow. And I could learn something about how those things go. It was a study opportunity. I was not in my real operating conscious. I think that I wasn't thinking about social justice so much as my own erudition. What an interesting moment I can be part of. So I joined it, just a little bit, so you should understand what was going on. There were 17 of us who left that conference. There were 350, 400 rabbis there. One of the rabbis, of course, was my senior rabbi at Mount Zion Temple in St. Paul. And I think just out of Derech Eretz, I went to see him first before I officially signed up to go in the delegation. And I said, I don't want to use his name because that's past history. But I called him by his first name, and I said, you know what? I didn't even call him by it. I said, Rabbi John. I think I want to go with that group of rabbis tomorrow to Florida. And his answer was the outstanding work of support. Gerry, why do you want to do that? Why do you want to go down there? You know it's not going to make any difference, don't you? I said, I don't know, but I'm sort of curious about it. I want to go. Oh, it's a waste of time. That's the encouragement I got from my rabbinic colleague. But you know what? The majority weren't going there. They were ready to throw some money into a pot to help us pay our airfare down south. So I got on the airplane the next morning with the 16 others, including side dressman. And we flew to the nearest airport, which was Jacksonville, Florida. Now, I suppose most of you don't know where St. Augustine is. It's in northern Florida, which is part of the Old South. It still is. It was a absolutely segregated city. I found out when I got there finally what the black people, the niggers as they were called, what they wanted was an opportunity to be hired as policemen, firemen, and other emergency workers. That was their request, for which they had been protesting for 2 months. I never read a word about that in the newspaper. I didn't read that every single night the black people of the town, or many of them, maybe most of them, would gather in their church or churches to pray and to unify and to try to gain self-respect. And then at about 8 o'clock at night, they would march to the old slave market, which was about a half a mile away from the Baptist church, which was the headquarters of the protest. They would march downtown. Often they were arrested. They were always harassed. They would go all the way downtown to what was the old slave market. Now it's just called the market, but it's a central square in St. Augustine. But not a word of it was in the paper. Not even in the St. Augustine paper did they ever cover it. Because it was just some, I don't know, crazy niggers who were upping, they were trying to, didn't know their place, didn't know how to behave properly. You know, it's sort of shocking to really come into the middle of that. They really felt quite abandoned. And it was the genius of Martin Luther King to get some nice white ministers, clergy people, get them to come down and march with these blacks on their nightly walk down to the slave market. It is a phenomenon. As I look back on it, I didn't even understand how scary a situation it would be for me. I wrote an article for the Central Conference of American Rabbis once, and I called it my scariest night. Scariest. I'll tell you about that. But you'll notice I'm sort of avoiding, why did I go there? Part of it was out of innocence, sheer blooming innocence. I'll go see what's happening. So the 17 of us were picked up at the airport in Jacksonville and driven less than an hour to St. Augustine. And we gathered outside the church, and we walked into the back of the church, and they were all in, I don't have the vocabulary for it, but the congregation was gathered and they were listening to Martin Luther King. who I had never met and hardly knew about. And I'm standing just inside the door at the back of the church. He could see us, but the congregation was listening to him. And we came in, and when he saw us, he stopped in the middle of his sentence. And he says these words of introduction. Ah, Moses's people have come to support us and stand with us. Now, I've never had an introduction like that since. I'm part of Moses. I am Moses's people, come to stand with these browbeaten black folks praying every night. So we went in and we sat down. Now, we were all dressed properly. We had been told, wear your rabbi costume. In those days, it was a dark suit, a tie, a white shirt. And I got to tell you, that may have been the hottest place I've ever had to sit. It was very hot and very humid, like a June day in the South can be. And it was awful, but it was picturesque. You know how the congregation was sitting there? They all had these there was no air conditioning, of course. The windows were open, it didn't matter. They had fans, you know how those fans, but they were ads for the local mortuary, and everybody sitting and fanning themselves with these mortuary fans. I wasn't laughing though, because it was really very interesting to observe. I'm always this kind of observer in this. And I heard what they were saying, and then they called on Cy Dresner to say a few words. Cy is the most arrested rabbi in all of America. He's still alive. There are 4 of us, 3 of us now that are left alive from that arrest scene. But Cy had already been arrested several times before that. That's why he was the contact that Martin Luther King chose. Yeah. And he was invited to talk. And this is in this hot, let me turn that off. Okay. It's hot. And Cy Dresner starts like rabbis can do, to talk and talk and talk. Well, you've all heard Martin Luther King speak. You know, that's one of the champion orators of the 20th century. That was and in comes Cy Dresner from New Jersey, and he begins to talk. And so help me, some of the senior rabbis in my own group start saying to him, Cy, genug, it's enough. They were telling him to stop. That was almost comical, because it was comical that he should be talking right in the footsteps of the master speaker. Finally, he got the hint and he stopped talking. And then we were taken out. We were told to go out and stand in front of the church. We were each of us paired off with a black partner. The strategy was to test the interstate commerce laws. St. Augustine was celebrating the fact that year that it was the anniversary of the founding of St. Augustine, Florida. And they were inviting Americans to come from wherever they lived in America to visit St. Augustine for the anniversary of the city. 350 years or some outrageous number, I don't remember. but they were inviting publicly with advertisements in newspapers and on television, come visit St. Augustine, the oldest city in America. We were coming from all over America. I was coming from Minnesota. And the black man who walked with me was there from Alabama. I think that's part of the United States too. We were all being part, we said, of the celebration of this city's anniversary. We should all be treated equally, some equal. Listen to what happens on my scariest night. I was paired off with this black man, and each of my colleagues was. We were to walk side by side down the center of the street from the church to the old slave market. There were about a dozen patrolmen that the governor had assigned to keep us from making trouble. So this dozen uniformed highway patrolmen, I would call them, they went 6 on one side and 6 on the other. And there were, I don't know, maybe 70, 80 black folks with us. We were a parade going downtown with, thank God, a dozen highway patrolmen on 6 on each side, but stretched out in a line that's pretty long. And because the St. Augustine newspaper had run the banner headline in the newspaper that day, that these clergymen from all over America, white men, are going to walk with blacks tonight downtown. That's the first time there was any article about the demonstrations in the St. Augustine newspaper. And everybody showed up to stand on the curbs. Think of the Rose Parade or something. They were all there, fathers with their kids on their shoulders so they could see what was going on. And on every single street corner, and I'm not exaggerating, on every single corner between the church and the market, there were gangs of hoodlums. People, they were angry as hell. They were maddened by the sight of whites and blacks walking together down the street. It violated every norm in their bodies. It was an assault, like what we saw on January 6th at the Capitol. And people that were just red, you know, they talk about rednecks. These were rednecks. In their hands, on one hand, they'd have a broken bottle, and in the other hand, they'd have a brick. And you knew full well that any moment now, they could let loose with that bottle or that brick. See why I call it a scary night? I walked through that, but not until I got the speech from Martin Luther King. He had us all lined up, and then he says to everybody, the blacks and the whites lined up, there's going to be a lot of people out there who don't like you. There's going to be a lot of people out there who are going to yell things at you, and you won't like what you hear. And you will want to speak back, or worse. And I tell you, we are pledged to nonviolence. We will not be violent, even verbally, with any of those people out there. That is our strength, being nonviolent. Our demonstration is that we are doing what we are doing. That's really noble advice. And I must say, it really struck me right there. I hadn't yet seen the mob out there, but he was telling me there's a mob of people out there that hate you for what you are doing. Walking down the street with blacks. And it's true. They yelled at us. You communists, get out of here. You goddamn Jews, go back where you came from. You don't belong here. Get out of here. Yeah, foul language of the most violent, horrible nature coming at you from the right and the left, from people who hate you, from people who are ready to just kill you. And I walked with my friend down the center of the street. We walked all the way to the marketplace. And then we were dismissed and we went home. Now, it wouldn't have been very hard for me to have been hurt. It sure happened the next night and the night after that. But you just have to, it's a lesson in how, how people can operate socially in terms of what they think is right and absolutely right. And what a horrible violation it was of everything normal. If I had walked naked down that street, like Hosea walked for several days in Jerusalem, theoretically, but I really was there in suit and tie on a hot night. It stuck in me. That was a turning point in my life. I came as an observer, and it turned me into a zealot for civil rights, for human rights. And it also inspired me with the message of nonviolence. You're not going to beat down, you can't beat down the system by beating harder on them. You've got to do something else. And we haven't yet figured it out, actually. We were arrested. When the next morning, I invited my black friend to have lunch with me at one of the nicer restaurants in town, next to Monson's Motor Lodge. We were all programmed. I did learn that demonstrations don't just erupt. Good demonstrations have some kind of organization to them. So some of us were assigned to go eat in a restaurant with one of our guests. Others were cued to go swimming in the pool of the Monson Motor Lodge. That was what got a picture on the front page of most American papers. These rabbis and their black friends swimming together in the pool, the swimming pool, with the manager of the Monson Motor Lodge pouring acid into the pool while they were swimming. I mean, it was a great photograph for the front page of papers. You can find it on the internet if you want. Um, I was doing something simpler. We parked the car and we made a circle of all of us who were going to be going into the restaurant. And we began to recite from memory Psalms, Psalm 23. That's a arrest. That's a cause for arrest in a situation like that. I was reciting the 23rd Psalm in English together with Black folks on the parking lot of the restaurant. And the police came around and arrested us one by one. They came up on me on either side, two plainclothes policemen. They grabbed me, one with this arm and one with this arm. And the newsreel caught that moment. I wouldn't have remembered what I said, but it's plainly recorded. I said, "Get your hands off me. I'm a human being." Now that was a statement of, I'm proud of myself for having had that response. I'm a human being. Not I'm a white man. Not I'm a rabbi. Not I'm from California. Not that I'm, a respectable middle class citizen. I'm a human being. Treat me like a human being is what I was yelling to no avail against the policemen who were grabbing me and the others. We said we wanted to be arrested together with the blacks and go with the blacks together. And they said, "Shut up and get in the car." Whites and blacks were segregated right at that moment. And we arrived in jail, St. John's Jail, and that's my booking sheet right there. That's a novel experience, getting arrested like that. It stays in my mind. Jail was hot. We all 17, plus two Episcopalian priests who had been arrested the day before. We were all put in one cell for two people. We were all of us jammed into two beds, one toilet, one sink, and we spent 24 hours there. I didn't know how long it would be, but the lawyers had said, "We'll get you out pretty soon." The lawyers from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. It was quite miserable in there. They had to give us food, had to give us healthy food. They weren't so dumb as to try to starve us or something or torture us. They just jammed us 17, 19 in a cell for two. And we took the beds apart so there was a mattress on the floor and the springs were on the bed, and we took turns sleeping. And they brought us breakfast, of course. Little cans or jars of Gerber's baby food. Baby food, strained spinach, strained peas, strained, I don't know what else. It's good food. There's nothing wrong with it nutritionally, but what a way to insult a bunch of, rabbis, let me be brave, clergymen, national visitors to your town, serve them baby food, little jars of baby food. We wouldn't eat it. But that was just, and then while we were in jail, the warden of the jail, who was also the sheriff of the jail, it's a little county, the warden, Hoss Manussi was his name. And he was the local leader of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, there's a qualification for being a warden in a jail, don't you think? He comes in to bring us a visitor. Mr. Bernstein, who ran a clothing store on Main Street. He came in to talk to the rabbis. He was the president of the local shul, no less. And what the hell is he going to say to us with Hosmanusi standing next to him and a store on Main Street? You rabbis don't know what you're doing here. We get along just fine here. Everything is just, we are neighbors. We shop in each other's stores, and it's very peaceful here. We get along very well, all of us. You people you're just here because you've been sent here and told the wrong thing about us. We're good people here. You can imagine the rest of the speech. You could write it yourself. And I don't blame him. He was infuriating, sort of, but still, the man does stay there. I know I'm going back to St. Paul. I know I'm getting out of there. But he lives there with his wife and his kids. He's making a decent living, selling clothing on Main Street in his little store, like hundreds of other Jews in the South used to do. But just in ways, he was right. We didn't know what was going on. On the other level, we knew what was going on and saw it altogether different than he saw it. And I was not embarrassed that I was protesting his system. I felt sorry for him, not me. But it was a learning experience. Love your neighbor. Can you do it? Try. Well, as promised, eventually, afternoon of the second day, the NAACP lawyers got us out of there. During the night, some of the rabbis got the idea. We should write a letter explaining why we went. It was modeled a bit on what Martin had done when he was in the Birmingham jail. Some of you may have read his letter from the Birmingham jail. Well, you can find online the letter for which I am a signature, letter from St. Augustine jail, or letter from St. John County jail, or something like that. I was looking for it. I can't find it in it right now, but you can find it online. It's eloquently written. It was a committee project. Did you ever try to get 17 rabbis to write one statement? That was going on between about 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. as we took turns sleeping on the mattress on the floor. I was pretty quiet because I was awed. I was really with senior rabbis, very important ones. I'm blocked right now on the name of my senior colleague who was the editor on that. What's his name? Chaim, do you remember it? I'll think of it when I stop trying to think of it. But he was a professor at the Hebrew Union College in New York.
Horowitz?
Borowitz, thank you. Borowitz. That's great. I always rely on time for help. Borowitz, he writes in a way that I would love to be able to write or speak. But he was taking our ideas and our arguments with one another and stating it out in beautiful English as a statement. It is a historical statement. Maybe So I got out and was driven back to the airport, and I flew not to St. Paul, but to LA, where my wife and baby daughter were visiting our family here in LA. And of course, I had to pay bail to get out of the jail. Um, I was arrested on 3 counts. Remember, one is trespassing. That one I've never figured out. I mean, is it trespassing to stand in the parking lot of a restaurant? I was arrested for disturbing the peace. The peace. And well, I guess the peace of that town was a segregationist system. But the big one really was conspiracy. And you know what? I plead guilty. I was part of a conspiracy to expose the inhuman qualities of an American city, the oldest American city. I was part of something much bigger than me. But that was a conspiracy in that town. A conspiracy which has its grip on America's civilization, the racism that runs through all of American civilization, now much more exposed. It's not just Mr. Bernstein who puts up with it in St. Augustine. It's everybody in Minneapolis, every policeman in St. Paul. It's part of the foundational structure of American life and our culture, racism. And we are and we continue to struggle with it, but it's layered so deeply, even into all of you good folks sitting and listening to me today. You can't live in America and not somehow be dragged into that racist tradition in ways you don't even recognize. I got back to Los Angeles, and my parents, who had read about it in the LA Times and seen it on the news and knew I was one of the people, they invited all the friends and relatives to come to the house the following night to gather with me. And you know what they did? Is they all came with money to pay off my bail. $300 in 1964 was $3,000 today. It was probably about $10,000 equivalent in today's money, of $10,000. And just family and friends were able to kick in that kind of money the night afterwards. And that wasn't the only people. Back in St. Paul, they were raising money. I wasn't even there yet, just based on the newspaper reports. It was a moment of great celebration or celebrity or vicarious appreciation. That my family loved me and would support me, okay. But that the 700 families of Mount Zion Temple in St. Paul were thrilled that their rabbi had gone to participate in those demonstrations, that I had been arrested. They really took pride in it. They were Jews and they felt that I was somehow or other doing something they didn't do or couldn't do, but they were sure glad their rabbi had done. They weren't embarrassed. They were fortified by it. I'm going to finish just with a story. I went back to St. Paul, I don't know, it's about 10 years ago. the congregation had a major milestone in its history, and they invited each week one of the former rabbis to come back to the synagogue and meet the congregations today. So I came and I was there on one Friday night. And this younger man, he was in his 30s, I guess, he comes up to me after the service, like people do in synagogues, and greet this clergy. He came back to Cohen. What's his first name? I've forgotten it. Steve Cohen. He was a member of the Minnesota state legislature. I'm going to cry. He had been in the confirmation class when I was there. And he came up to me. He told me he's now in the state assembly, a representative. I don't know why I get out of control there. He's in the assembly, and he has a reputation for supporting all kinds of social justice legislation. He tells me, the reporters always ask him, why are you involved in this, whatever social justice legislation it is? And his answer always is, because my rabbi went to jail. I couldn't say it. My rabbi went to jail. That's a story that encapsulates a whole range of values. I guess he saw it as heroic. I suppose it was heroic in a way. But he wanted to model his behavior in the state legislature of Minnesota the way he did, because his rabbi was arrested. Why did I go? So I could be famous? No, that wasn't it. So I'd sort of understand how demonstrations are run. Well, I kind of got that. There's a poem I read some years ago that was in the handout of a performance of a theater performance at the Mark Taper. Forget the name of it. It was a very, very fine drama about a Austrian man during the Nazi period who refused to serve in the German army. And he was killed, murdered, punished for it. It was well done. But in that little handout, the program, it says that somewhere in one's life, there's a grand moment presented to you. And you either say yes or no. And you live with your answer for the rest of your life. Well, I said yes to Martin Luther King's invitation. And it really has made a huge difference in my life ever since. Somebody's writing, a Jewish guy, is writing another biography about Martin Luther King Jr. He interviewed me earlier this week for what I remember of Martin Luther King. He's writing this book. He's interviewed all the Gedolim, all the big people who ever met and worked with Martin Luther King. And he's asking me now on a Zoom talk, not Zoom, well, just he and I. And he asked, why did you go? People are always asking me, why did you go? And I went because there was a still small voice in me that somehow, in ways I don't comprehend, giving me direction and focus. So here we are. It's an hour you've been listening to me. You want to know why I went? You figure it out. You figure it out.
Rabbi Gerry, I'm wondering if you would let us just, first of all, just have a moment to absorb the power of everything you've said. And in a moment, allow us to not so much ask questions, but just to join in the power of all that you've said to us this morning. I've heard the story. I've never heard it like this today. And I just need to thank you for sharing this with us today. And I want to just let us sit for a moment. Can we ask questions? Let me invite people who have reactions to go to the button down below where it says reactions, and there is a place to raise a hand if you'd like to um, say something or ask a question.
I can't see all the little rectangles here. Can you patch them together, hon?
I'll patch it together. Don't worry. I'll call on people.
So what do you make of my story?
Say again, please.
What do you make of my story?
Well, it's interesting because yesterday we were on a Zoom with, many of us were on a Zoom with Richard Hecht regarding the Middle East. And he was sharing, I think, a sense of the hopelessness that many of us feel about what we're observing. And as often happens, his analysis is that what was lacking in the situation of Israel was the leadership of religious people. And the question I was preparing for you today was the question in the way that you've answered. You answered, why did you go to St. Augustine? But you've also answered the question, what difference does it make that people of religious commitment were leading and were in the forefront and took the leadership in that struggle. The presence of people who had very political ideas. One of the things that Richard Hecht said is that religion is political. It's not apolitical. There's no such thing as apolitical, I think he would argue. And
You think I went for religious reasons? For political reasons?
no, I think that in the larger sense of what political means, that politics is about life. You began as I heard you, as a person that was curious and became committed there was a transformation. And that transformation can only happen if a person is open to the religious demand of the hour, which is what you responded to.
Thank you.
That's a comment, mate, more than the Hyman Goodman family is going to say something. Please. Unmute. We can't hear you until you unmute. There. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. And thank you, Rabbi. And thank you all thanks so much for eloquent story, eloquent, memorable comments about a journey. The question I had is, have you ever gone back to St. Augustine to visit the people? And what did you find, and when did you go?
This time, it was 50 years later. We were warmly greeted. There is change that has happened and change that hasn't happened. But there is change, and our return was sponsored by the St. Augustine Jewish Historical Society, which is bent on observing the history of the Jews in St. Augustine. And they had arranged with the local museum to have an exhibit of the events of 1964. And there were lots of reporters, even national reporters, who were there. Mind you, there were 50 years later, I may have been the youngest, but I was already a senior. So it was heartening to see Blacks in positions of responsibility at the museum. The lunch counters were open, restaurants were open. Some of the public facilities were integrated. But in Lincoln Town, the section of St. Augustine where Blacks had begun to live right after the Civil War. Lincoln Town tells you, freed Blacks lived in Lincoln Town. It is now a place where there are Blacks living, many of them in sort of old cottages. And then intermittent, because it's near downtown, it's getting gentrified. And there have been new places built there. You know the story of how when slums or bad areas or something start to get gentrified because the land is cheap and people have money and they get integrated. Capitalism in ways is a great integrator of people. It was weird being there, but not scary at all. I felt some sense of triumph. They interviewed me for the University of Florida. Interviewed me. Guess what question they had for me to write for the oral history project at the University of Florida. Rabbi, why did you come to St. Augustine? So among the hundreds of times I've given my story, there it is, recorded in response to questions from the oral history project of the University of Florida. I'm flattered to be part of oral history in an American university. It was interesting going back and meeting some of the people. Um, there is now a Reform synagogue, and it was a real center for people who were celebrating our return. For the Reform Jews in town, even the conservative synagogue, they were part of welcoming us with pride. Orthodox Jews were still left out of the mix. It's we're living in the same tradition, but on a different planet or something. It's a disappointment to me. But we Jews are a pluralistic people. There are many ways to be a Jew. There are many ways to be a good Jew. And we lean on those resources that we have and want to expand. Long answer. Thank you, Alan.
Other questions, thoughts, reflections? Um, I think, Jerry, we want to express on behalf of all of us the gratitude that we feel in having heard this story. When we originally conceived of this program, it was right after the verdict in the Chauvin case.
That's true.
And you told me the story of the reception at the St. Paul Synagogue where you served.
Mhm.
And it's, of course, difficult today to think of how the Jewish community has changed in just a few phrases and a few thoughts. But I know that maybe you have some closing reflections about that issue in the Jewish community.
Let me
It's
have a
hard
go
for me
at that.
to, pardon?
Let me have a go of that. We're trying to. It's gotten late. Let me say, it went through my head. My entrance into civil rights argumentation starts when I'm a rabbi in Minnesota, across the river from Minneapolis. And the case this year, the Chauvin case, it's last year and this year already. That is a monumental occasion. And I said that to my sister, who now lives in Minneapolis and is a member of a synagogue there. That for me, the Chauvin case is another huge step for dealing with racism. That the policemen were officially charged and convicted. Well, so far only one has been charged and convicted of I forget whatever it is. He's found guilty of murdering Floyd. That a policeman is held responsible for observing the rules of decency which govern American justice is monumental. The Senate of the United States in 1964 was considering the first of the great civil rights laws of 1964. There was a 64, a 65, and I think a 66. 3 laws which dealt with a lot with regularizing civil rights for Blacks. The first of those bills was stuck in the Senate and it was being filibustered. It had been filibustered, held up in the United States Senate for about 3 months. A week after our arrest, and no doubt reflecting in some proportion our arrest and demonstration, the filibuster came to an end and the Senate adopted the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Had to do with voting rights. Some acts make a difference. There is a ripple effect. In the history books of the 1960s, I'm a footnote. I'm a footnote for having been one of the 17 rabbis arrested in what led to the passage of the civil rights bills. It's not my judgment. It's Branch, I forget his last name, the historian who wrote the story of the 60s and Martin Luther King. I don't know, there's for me, a kind of wrapping around my life as a civil libertarian gets kindled when I'm at Mount Zion and St. Paul, and it finds some kind of realization years later in the Chauvin case in Minneapolis. I said that to my sister, and she says, you know, you're right. It is good that Minnesota is a place for change in the rigors of segregation and racism. Minnesota, which is pretty white, can be a place that leads many of us to recognize the disability of people of color, Black, Latino, Korean, whatever. They're all Americans, like we are all Americans. That is the heritage of this country. Yeah, we have to keep hope. If there's anything that must distinguish Jews, it is their hope. That goes back to your reading of Hosea today. Hosea was calling on the people of his time who were experiencing a whole threat to their existence in ancient Palestine and saying, we have to do what's right. We have to recognize God's law, which is a human rights law. We have to do that, and we can do it, and it will lead to a better world. The crops will come in on time. I hope the crops can come in time very soon. We've done a terrible job of messing up our planet. We're working on it. We have to have hope. I grow desperate with Palestine-Israel quarrel. I don't want it to go on forever. It can't go on forever. There has to be a breakthrough. May it come soon.
Rabbi Gerry and friends of Beth Orr and everyone who's been a witness this morning to this wonderful Zoom, I want to thank you for your participation. I think we have some very powerful and important lessons and opportunities to learn. I'm glad we've recorded this session. A special warm thanks to you, Gerry, and we are in your debt for all that you've taught us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your rapt attention. I'm awed.
Wish everyone a good Shabbos. Shabbat Shalom. I'm serving virtual peach jam because the peaches have come in. This year I succeeded in wresting most of the peaches from the squirrels. And so there is, I'll be sending it over the next Zoom because you'll join us for Shavuos. We'll let you put it on your blintzes tomorrow night. We look forward to seeing you. If we have a wonderful Shavuot program. We have 5 rabbis, 16 clowns, bears, tigers, a congregation of Torot, fabulous somersaults, and we
a tightrope walker even.
say again.
You're going to walk the tightrope right across the arena.
Right, and we have this mountain that's going to be held above our heads, and we will decide. Well, okay, I'll tell you the rest later tomorrow. Shabbat shalom. See you tomorrow night.
Thank you. Shabbat shalom.